I'm really just going to look at 4 slides between now and lunchtime. And the first one, actually, I'd really just like you to look at and to shout some things out. This is a very traditional, probably 1980s sort of view of the policy process. I could have presented this as a circle, because it's often called the policy cycle. The notion of how policy is actually identified, developed, refined over time. So a critical part, you work out what your problem is, what's the best policy in order to respond to that. You probably have to get some approval. You have to make sure that there are ways of then budgeting for what you're doing and planning some implementation. You implement it. At the end, you evaluate, and you learn from the evaluation, which informs all the other parts. So as you're learning, that's informing what you then do in the future. So the feedback from evaluation through to the other aspects is critical. And probably since these diagrams were first sort of developed, there has been a big trend towards outcome-based monitoring. So we now know that in M&E systems, you don't just wait for the evaluation at the end. You're supposed to do it on an ongoing basis, but the principle is the same, that you're supposed to be learning from what's going on and informing the development of new policies or the tweaking of existing policies. Okay, this is very a functional view of things. So you haven't got the current terms on there. We haven't got the medium-term agricultural sector strategy on there. In fact, we haven't got anything about how policies for individual value chains are nested within sector-wide policy systems. Okay, so it's very simplified. We haven't got joint sector reviews on there. But it's the basic functions of designing a policy that are up there. This is presented as if it's a sort of technical exercise, and it's all about the evidence. You know, what's the problem? What are the policy options that enable us to best address that problem? You formulate it and you get approval from it, where it's presumed you're supposed to say, this is a good policy. Okay, tick. And all of it, and the evaluation informing everything else, is all about, fundamentally, it's evidence that's driving policy. So the last point there is a great place to start, which is actually often, how much is it really driven by evidence and how much is it driven by interests? I would argue that evidence is used by interests to make their case. Insofar as you have to go through a formal policy process like this, people with an interest in having something find bits of evidence in order to make their case. It's not often that it's a completely neutral exercise. The conflicting evidence is set out and the decisions are based purely on the basis of evidence. Certainly there are interests involved. They could be lobby groups, they could be the interests of the people within the process, but it's a much more political process than just a technical one based on evidence. You also get lots of reversals, okay? And you get policies which are perhaps formulated, perhaps approved, never get a budget, okay? Or never get to the implementation stage. Or partway through the implementation, actually it's just changed or scrapped completely. And often that's because the people who didn't support it in the first place, they perhaps were not able to prevent it getting onto the official policy documents. They may not even have been able to prevent it getting approved, but come to the implementation and they had their ways of opposing it so that the policy didn't happen as was expected. So almost every stage of that process is contested by people with conflicting views. I think you made a point like that earlier on in the process. And there are inconsistencies. So we've heard that there may be multiple processes. You know, some of them funded by different donors, some of them sponsored by different ministries, targeting the same thing, doing it in parallel and sometimes in competition or conflict. But you can also find that within a given process, you don't have agreement with all the necessary stakeholders. We're going to talk about, the multiplicity of stakeholders that there are within the agricultural sector. You don't have agreement even necessarily within a particular institution. And so what we're trying to do is just bring a bit more of the sort of political reality into this. Our policy making process is not only a technical thing. Here is an example that, because I have a long-standing interest in cotton in Africa, looking at attempts to introduce a program of contract farming in cotton in Tanzania, been going for 5 or 6 years. And basically, it sort of ground to a halt. There's still a hope that it can be brought up again. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of this, but this is just a little map of people who are involved in this process. And I've got 4 points I want to make to you. So the first one, I find this really interesting. We talk about political will to get something done. As far as this program was concerned, it was invited in by the president. The prime minister supported it. It was fundamentally owned by the Tanzanian Cotton Board, which is the regulator responsible for these things. They wanted to propose this. They have backed it consistently throughout. The staff in the Ministry of Agriculture have been sort of neutral, because they're focused on other things, or positive. This is a good thing. The minister has opposed it. Okay? They're actually, I won't tell you the full story of that now, but just so you know, there isn't a clear vertical chain of command there. And the key person who has to present the act to Parliament, who has to, ultimately, he can undermine any of the licensing procedures of TCB because there's a process of appeal to the minister. Key person not on board. Okay, so that's just within the government system. Okay? Now, in the cotton zone, up in the lake zone of Tanzania, you have the MPs in the area. And you have the regional and district commissioners. Okay, they're not based in Dar, although they probably spend quite a bit of their time in Dar, but they should be based in the cotton zone. They should be looking at the same information about what's happening in this pilot project and in the scaling up, how's it going. Okay, the RCs and DCs have been overwhelmingly positive in backing this. Okay, they can see that actually levies from a growing cotton industry bring more money into the regional and district coffers, but they can also see that the farmers like it. Okay, and there's plenty of, primarily anecdotal evidence, but plenty of it that the farmers generally like it. The MPs, who should be campaigning to, promote stuff that's in their constituents' interest, have been opposed to this program throughout. They should be looking at the same evidence as the RCs and the DCs, but actually they've come to a different view, and they have lobbied strongly against it and influence the minister. We talk about let's bring other stakeholders in, it can help us with a better process. The GINAs, there are 40 plus of those in Tanzania. Some of those will win from this proposal, some of them will lose. Okay? So some have been in favour of it, but others have been hostile, and so have lobbied the MPs and have lobbied the minister. So the private sector is not a homogeneous entity here. If you had 1 or 2 private sector representatives in the discussion, who knows whether they represent the views? The views are diametrically opposite within the private sector. Enthusiastic. Their farmers' association started off as positive, then got disgruntled about something, GINAs who were opposed, and suddenly came out campaigning against the thing and holding rallies to oppose the thing. Okay? Make it an inclusive process, bring the farmers' representatives in. Is it going to help us with our better process? And finally, if you went back to my previous slide and just think about which people are involved in this, there are certainly some people in here who you wouldn't necessarily think of as being involved. The regional and district commissioners formally in Tanzania would not be part of that policy-making process. But there are important people who actually have influenced, whether it's gone ahead or not, who are not part of that political process. Okay, so the actual process of not just devising it, because initially it was fairly technical. The problem identification and the policy formulation, there was a certain amount of stakeholder involvement, but it was a fairly technical process. But then as soon as it came to policy approval, it was contested. Although it went ahead, the implementation has basically run into the ground due to opposition. So it got through the first stages and ran aground in the implementation phase. Okay, and it was a very, very political process, not a technical process, which explains the outcomes that have actually been observed on the ground. Here's another way of looking at politics. We tend to think, and in fact you could read what Steve said earlier, that it's our policy that we do and we implement that affects our agricultural performance. Policy is important, but you can't take policy in a vacuum. What incentives are there for, particularly, I've put the state here, I'm going to broaden this out a bit, but in particular for state actors to produce policies and to implement policies and bringing in other stakeholders if necessary. So we shouldn't just think about what we can do with policy, we have to think about what are the institutions that are supporting that and are creating the incentives for that. And fundamentally, those incentives are derived from the political system. So if we're going to think about our policy, let's not just think about what it is we're actually supposed to formally be implementing, but what are the institutions supporting that? What are the politics that are enabling that? And as I was listening to your expectations, some of you could clearly see that you were in situations where the institutional incentives for being effective were not right. And you're still wanting, how can we get our, win-win-win policies, but you already know that you're in an institutional setting which is not helpful. And we will talk about the case of Rwanda a bit later, which does have a supportive political system, we'll talk about that later, but has systematically looked at its institutional arrangements in order to structure them so as to give the right incentives for policy, not just design, but policy delivery and implementation. So I guess I just want to caution at this stage, there are going to be times where the politics really are not helpful and the institutions are not helpful, and you'd have to be a magician to get a win-win policy in that context, okay? Sadly, we're not magicians. We are going to talk about what we can do when we recognize the political constraints and how we identify opportunities for when you might get change. But some of what comes out of looking at the politics is simply to realize we have some fairly major obstacles at the moment, and we've got to see when is a window of opportunity to see if we can get change in the institutions and in the incentives for action. So, what I'm hoping that Steve and I do in terms of our input is we think about policy from the technical side, which in this diagram is the columns, and we think about policy from the political side, which is the rows. And both need to be right if you're going to get your successful policies. And really, on this diagram, we want to somehow see how can we get to this? This is where we're all wanting to get to, is our policy success stories. And often we just tell them in terms of the technical design of the policy. But actually we need to be saying, well, what the technical design was good, but it was also appropriate to the political context, and we had the political support to get that policy through. Underlying this diagram, there's a notion that in order to even get on the agenda, if we talk about policy identification, going back to my earlier slide, for policy identification, you either need some technical people to say this would be a good thing for us to consider. Those could be technocrats in the ministry. Somebody said NGOs may come up with this, donor organizations may come up with this, but somebody from a sort of technical perspective has got to suggest this is a good idea for it to get on the agenda, or there's got to be some sort of political drive which we may not fully understand, but that brings an idea onto the agenda. If there's neither of those, this box is blank. Okay, so let's ignore this box. What often happens is that there is technical support for something, and then we say, but there was no political will, it never happened. And I call this inertia. In fact, it's not me, it was a colleague here from, who was working, a Kenyan colleague, Gemang Gwingskothek, who complained about this bitterly sort of 10 years ago here in Kenya, that there was so much of that. There were so many good ideas, no political will, nothing happened, okay? You had to put the policy up to the cabinet to get cabinet approval. 3 years later, the cabinet hadn't got round to it because they were too busy discussing other things, okay? Or it could get stuck at you needed some legislation. Legislation never got passed, okay? In my Tanzanian cotton example, the first delay in the whole process was they needed a change to the Cotton Act to give the Cotton Board powers to regulate contract farming. Well, it was a long delay because the minister wasn't keen on going forward with that. Okay? Or you just get a policy, it gets into your policy document, but it's never put in a budget, and it doesn't happen. Or there can be all sorts of reasons why you end up with inertia. At some point, the policy goes into the long grass, okay, and just stays there. I've even put that in a slightly bigger font than the others because I think that's one of the most common outcomes there is. You can have something which is possibly even worse, which is where you've got something that the politicians come up with and the technocrats say, no, don't do that. You know, it's going to be a disaster, and it happens anyway, okay? And I call that anti-poor policy. And here, I've divided this box into two because sometimes it's quite difficult to decide whether your success story is a full success. And this afternoon, when we look at the Malawi fertilizer program, that was heralded as a success by lots of people. You can judge for yourselves as we discuss it this afternoon whether it's really a success story or a policy that eventually has become so distorted by the politics that it's not really anymore. There was massive political support for it. There was a good technical design. It definitely has had some positive impact, but has it dropped from here down to here? Well, we'll let you judge that this afternoon, okay? Now, in all countries, not just African countries, it's equally true in UK or anywhere else, you have these issues that something needs political support as well as a good technical design, okay? So the issue is, to what extent are those things opposed to each other or conflicting with each other? And there is a literature which we will discuss after lunch which says that there are reasons why in some countries these two things are much less well aligned than they are in other countries, and we're going to look into that. Let me just do this. We're going to talk about lessons from political economy. This does follow on a little bit from the last diagram. One way that people approach questions in what we might call political economy analysis is as follows. They ask, it's a lot about, if you could call it mandates, but if I tell you mandates, you'll think about what people have promised to the electorate, and that's a little bit misleading. The question is, if you're a leader, political leader, you could look at this if you're going for the president, you could look at this if you're campaigning to be an MP, you could look at this if you're campaigning to be the governor of a county in Kenya. Whose support do you need to obtain or to maintain power? Okay, you may need some votes, so you need some citizens. You may need, prior to even being the candidate, to get the party's nomination, so you may need backing within the party. Sometimes that is almost more important than the actual election itself. Okay, in Tanzania, where CCM hasn't lost, arguably the campaign, the selection, who's going to be the new candidate for CCM, is more important than the actual election in terms of deciding who's going to be the president. Okay? Because the one who CCM nominates always wins. So who's going to be the CCM candidate is a real challenge, and whose support do they need? And that, at that point, is not the citizens. That's people within the party. So that then becomes quite important. You may need the media to back you. You will definitely, whatever your system, need financial backers. Who are they? Is a really key question. What do you have to offer these people in exchange for their support? Okay? And a nice theory of democracy says you offer them good policies. Okay? But often, it's not policy that wins it, and we'll talk about that after lunch. You can make appeals to voters on all sorts of matters. They can be, they can be ethnic appeals, they can be appeals to a particular community which has nothing to do with national policy, they can be quite private arrangements. I'm going to help you with your funeral costs, will you vote for me? Thank you. Okay, and all of those sorts of things that come in. There are various appeals that people make. Sometimes when it's influential people, it's not particularly policy that you're promising them, but you're going to do them some favors later. So if they're businessmen who are backing your campaign, you're going to do some sort of favor that will benefit their business later. You'll either protect them against something, or you'll give them a particular tax waiver, or they can have an import license for a commodity it's scarce to get an import license for. They can get access to land, which they may not do through the formal process. There are all sorts of things that you may offer people in exchange for support. And the critical question is, whose support do you really need? And it's those promises that are likely to be the ones that are kept in future. And many promises will be made to the electorate. And as we know, many of those promises to the electorate are not kept. But the promises to the people who really count, more of those do tend to be kept, and they can be at odds with official manifesto commitments or even with formal policy documents. Where does agricultural policy fit into this? Well, in some countries it's really important in determining the outcomes of elections, okay? But in other countries it's not. And if agricultural policy wasn't particularly important in determining the outcome of the election, maybe it's not one of the key commitments that you've made that you know you've got to keep. If there are other priorities that you've got to keep first, you deal with those. That varies from country to country, however. How's all this changing with democratization? We're going to look at these sorts of questions after lunch.